For almost 1,000 years, Japan was shaped by warriors who lived by a strict code. They carried swords. They served powerful lords. They protected a world built on honor and tradition. They were called the samurai. But the samurai were never just soldiers. They became the rulers, the thinkers, and the symbol of an entire era. For centuries, Japan belonged to them, until one day, the same government they protected decided they were no longer needed. In the late 1800s, Japan changed faster than almost any country in history. Ancient traditions collided with modern technology. Swords met guns, castles faced factories, and a warrior class that had ruled for generations suddenly had to face an impossible question. How did Japan go from a country ruled by warriors to a modern industrial power? And why did some samurai choose to fight against the very nation they once served? To understand the fall of the samurai, we have to go back hundreds of years, back to a Japan where emperors existed, but warriors controlled the real power. For centuries, Japan was controlled by military leaders called shoguns. These powerful commanders ruled in the name of the emperor, while samurai served as the backbone of their armies and government. The samurai followed a set of values often called bushido. It emphasized loyalty, discipline, courage, and acceptance of death. Their identity was built around service. But the samurai world was not as simple as legends make it appear. They were not only warriors. Many became administrators, teachers, writers, and politicians. Their swords represented power, but their influence reached far beyond the battlefield. By the 1800s, however, Japan was facing a crisis. Foreign powers were expanding across Asia. Western nations had stronger weapons, larger navies, and industrial economies. Japan could no longer remain isolated forever. Then, in 1853, 4 American warships arrived in Japan. They carried weapons unlike anything many Japanese people had ever seen. Their arrival would begin the chain of events that ended the age of the samurai forever. Before the samurai disappeared, Japan had spent more than 2 centuries living under a system called the Tokugawa shogunate. It was a world carefully controlled by strict rules, social classes, and traditions that had barely changed for generations. At the top of society stood the samurai. Below them were farmers, craftsmen, and merchants. Everyone had a place, everyone had expectations. Changing your position in life was extremely difficult. The samurai were supposed to be warriors. But after years of peace, many had no battles to fight. Instead, they became government officials, advisors, and scholars. Their swords remained symbols of status, even when they were rarely used. This long period of peace created a strange contradiction. Japan's warriors became less focused on fighting, while the rest of the world was rapidly developing new military technology. For centuries, Japan had limited contact with foreign nations. The Tokugawa government believed isolation protected the country from outside threats. But while Japan looked inward, other nations were expanding across the globe. Europe and the United States were entering the industrial age. Steamships crossed oceans faster. Factories produced weapons in huge numbers. Technology was changing the balance of power between nations. Japan could not ignore these changes forever. Powerful countries wanted access to Japanese ports for trade and supplies. Eventually, one nation arrived with enough force to demand an answer. When Commodore Matthew Perry arrived in 1853 with American warships, Japan faced a terrifying reality. The outside world had changed. The old methods that protected Japan for centuries were no longer enough. The arrival of foreign ships created a national debate. Some believed Japan needed to modernize quickly. Others believed foreign influence threatened everything Japan had protected. This disagreement would eventually destroy the Tokugawa system itself. The samurai who once protected the government would become the same people challenging it. Japan was approaching a revolution. The arrival of foreign ships exposed a weakness that Japan had tried to hide. The Tokugawa shogunate looked powerful from the outside, but inside, many people were beginning to question whether it could protect the country anymore. Many Japanese leaders looked at Western technology and saw a dangerous gap. Foreign ships were larger, weapons were more advanced. Industrial production allowed other nations to create power on a scale Japan had never seen before. A famous slogan began spreading among those who wanted change: a rich country, a strong army. They believed Japan needed to modernize quickly or risk becoming controlled by foreign powers. But not everyone wanted to abandon the old system. Many samurai believed the shogunate had failed because it allowed foreign influence into Japan. They wanted to restore power to the emperor and remove outside threats. The conflict grew stronger between supporters of the shogun and those who wanted a new Japan. Political arguments turned into violence, alliances changed. Former friends became enemies. In 1868, the crisis reached its breaking point. A group of powerful leaders declared that the emperor should take direct control of Japan again. This event became known as the Meiji Restoration. The Tokugawa shogunate had ruled Japan for over 260 years. Now, almost overnight, the system that shaped the entire country was collapsing. The samurai had lost the political structure that gave them their power. For some samurai, this was not just a political change. It was the destruction of their entire way of life. Their position, their income, and their purpose were all suddenly threatened. The new government believed Japan needed to move forward. It wanted a modern nation with a modern army, but creating that future meant removing the privileges that the samurai had enjoyed for centuries. The samurai had spent generations protecting Japan's leaders. Now those same leaders were changing the country in a way that left the samurai behind. The question was no longer whether Japan would change. The question was whether the samurai would accept it. The Meiji government wanted to transform Japan into a modern nation. But modernization came with a painful cost. The samurai class, once the most respected group in society, was slowly being dismantled. One of the first major changes was the creation of a national army. Instead of relying only on samurai warriors, Japan began recruiting ordinary citizens and training them with modern weapons. For centuries, carrying a sword had been a privilege of the samurai. The sword represented their identity, their honor, their place in society. Then in 1876, the government issued the Hate-Re Edict. Samurai were forbidden from wearing swords in public. A symbol that had defined them for hundreds of years was suddenly taken away. To many samurai, this was more than a law. It felt like an attack on their entire existence. They had lost their special status, their traditional income, and now even the weapon that represented who they were. Some samurai adapted. They became teachers, businessmen, government officials, and soldiers in the new army. They accepted that Japan had changed and tried to find a new role. But others could not accept the new world. They believed the government had betrayed the values that made Japan strong. To them, modernization had gone too far. Many former samurai were also struggling financially. The government had removed their traditional payments, leaving some warriors without income or purpose. A proud class was suddenly facing uncertainty. The anger among former samurai continued growing. Small rebellions began appearing across Japan. The government responded with force, sending its modern army to stop them. The final and greatest rebellion would come from a legendary samurai named Saigō Takamori. Once a powerful supporter of the new era, he would become the symbol of the last stand of the samurai. Saigō Takamori was not an ordinary samurai. He was one of the most respected warriors and political leaders in Japan. He helped create the new Meiji government before eventually turning against it. At first, Saigō believed modernization was necessary. He wanted Japan to become stronger and protect itself from foreign powers. But he disagreed with how quickly the government was destroying the traditional role of the samurai. The disagreement became impossible to ignore. Many former samurai felt abandoned by the government they had helped create. They believed their loyalty had been rewarded with humiliation. In 1877, thousands of former samurai gathered in Saigō's home region of Satsuma. What began as a political disagreement became a full rebellion against the Meiji government. The rebels were skilled warriors. Many had spent their entire lives training with swords and studying warfare. But they were facing something completely different, a modern national army. At the beginning of the rebellion, the samurai achieved several victories. Their experience, discipline, and courage allowed them to challenge a much larger force. But courage could not overcome technology forever. The government army had thousands of trained soldiers, modern weapons, and access to supplies that the rebels could not match. The final battle took place at Shiroyama in Kagoshima. Surrounded and outnumbered, Saigō and his remaining warriors prepared for their last stand. The battle lasted only a short time. The samurai rebels were defeated. The age of the warrior class that had shaped Japan for centuries had finally come to an end. Saigō Takamori became known as the last samurai, but his story was not simply about losing a war. It was about a civilization struggling with a question many societies eventually face. The Satsuma Rebellion was over. The samurai had lost their final battle. But the story of the samurai did not end on the battlefield. Their influence continued shaping Japan in unexpected ways. The Meiji government had removed the samurai as a social class, but it did not erase their values completely. Ideas like discipline, loyalty, and dedication continued influencing Japanese society. Many former samurai found new careers in the modern Japan they once resisted. Some became politicians. Some became businessmen. Others joined the new military that replaced their old warrior class. In a strange twist of history, some of the same warrior traditions that disappeared from the battlefield became part of Japan's national identity. The samurai also became a powerful symbol around the world. Stories of their discipline, swordsmanship, and loyalty spread far beyond Japan's borders. But the popular image of the samurai is not always the full truth. Movies and legends often show perfect warriors following an unchanging code. Real samurai were much more complicated. They were humans living through a difficult period of change. Some protected tradition. Some embraced the future. Some fought. Some adapted. Their choices depended on their circumstances. The end of the samurai was not just the end of warriors carrying swords. It was the end of an entire social system that had defined Japan for hundreds of years. Japan's transformation was incredibly fast. Within only a few decades, the country went from a feudal society to an industrial power capable of competing with Western nations. The samurai lost their old world, but they became part of Japan's new story. Their disappearance was not simply a defeat, it was the price of a nation transforming itself. The samurai disappeared as a political class, but they never disappeared from human imagination. Their story became one of the most recognizable symbols of Japan around the world. Part of the reason is the powerful idea behind the samurai. They represented discipline, patience, loyalty, and the pursuit of mastery. These ideas continued long after the last battles ended. Modern Japan still carries traces of this history. The importance placed on dedication, responsibility, and improvement has roots that reach back through centuries of tradition. But history also teaches us something important. Traditions can be powerful, but they can also disappear when the world around them changes. The samurai were not destroyed because they were weak. They disappeared because the entire world around them transformed. New technology changed warfare. New ideas changed governments. New systems replaced old ones. This is a pattern that appears throughout history. Powerful groups often fall not because an enemy defeats them, but because they cannot adapt to a changing world. The story of the samurai is therefore not only about Japan, it is about every society that faces the same difficult choice: protect the past or build the future. The final samurai did not lose because they lacked courage. They lost because history had moved in a direction that swords could not stop. Yet their story survived. Books were written. Films were created. Generations around the world learned about the warriors who lived by honor and faced the end of their era. The samurai remind us that nothing in history is permanent. Technology changes, traditions disappear, but the stories humans leave behind can survive for centuries. The story of the samurai is often remembered as a story of warriors and battles, but the deeper story is about a society experiencing one of the fastest transformations in human history. In just a few decades, Japan changed from a feudal society into an industrial nation. The transformation was so dramatic that people who lived through it could barely recognize their own country. For the samurai, this change was personal. They were not simply losing jobs. They were losing an identity that had been passed down through generations. A young samurai born into a warrior family expected to inherit a certain life. He expected training, honor, service, and a respected position in society. Suddenly, that future no longer existed. This is why the Satsuma Rebellion was about more than politics. It was about memory, pride, tradition, and the fear that an entire way of life was disappearing forever. But history rarely moves backward. Once technology, economies, and governments change, old systems often cannot return to the way they were before. The fall of the samurai was painful, but it helped create modern Japan. The same nation that ended the warrior class became one of the most advanced countries in the world. The irony is that the samurai helped build the future that replaced them. Many former warriors became leaders, educators, and soldiers who shaped the new Japan. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the samurai is not about fighting. It is about adaptation. The world changes whether we are ready or not. The last samurai were not simply warriors who lost a battle. They were people caught between two worlds. One was disappearing. The other was being born. More than 100 years have passed since the samurai fought their final battle, yet their image remains one of the strongest symbols of Japan ever created. People around the world recognize the samurai. Their armor, swords, and discipline have appeared in books, movies, games, and stories across generations. But the real history of the samurai is more complicated than the legends. They were not perfect heroes. They were humans living through political struggles, economic problems, and a rapidly changing world. Some samurai fought to preserve the old ways. Others accepted change and helped create the future. There was never only one samurai story. The end of the samurai shows a truth that appears throughout history. Even powerful groups can disappear when the world around them changes faster than they can adapt. The same pattern happened to knights in Europe, ancient warriors in China, and countless other groups throughout history. No tradition is guaranteed to survive forever. What makes the samurai story fascinating is that they did not simply vanish, they transformed. Their skills, values, and ideas continued in new forms. The sword was taken away, the armor was abandoned, the social class disappeared, but the ideas behind the samurai survived. This is why the samurai remain fascinating today. They represent a moment when an ancient world collided with a modern one. Their final battle was not just a military defeat. It was the final chapter of an era that had lasted for centuries. The samurai remind us that history is not only written by winners. It is also written by those who disappear and leave behind questions. What happens when a world built around tradition suddenly meets a world built around technology? Japan's answer was transformation. It chose modernization, even when that meant leaving behind a part of its own past. The samurai lost their position, but their story became immortal. Few groups in history have disappeared from society while becoming more famous in culture. Their story teaches us that survival is not always about staying the same. Sometimes survival means changing into something completely new. The samurai did not survive because they kept their swords. They survived because their ideas traveled beyond the battlefield. Every generation faces the same challenge. The world changes. New technology arrives. Old systems disappear. The question is whether we can change with it. The final samurai were not simply the end of something. They were the bridge between two different worlds. They showed humanity something important. Even when an era ends, its influence can continue shaping the future. The samurai were defeated, their world disappeared, but their story survived. Because history does not only remember those who win. It remembers those who change the world.